Welcome to Asiatique. I'm your host, Dr. Raymond. China domination. Well, China's GDP surpassed the US in 2013, and with recent sightings of jet fighters flying across the Taiwan Straits, people are already saying that China is going to go for Taiwan, and once they get Taiwan, they are going to dominate the world. In this episode, we're going to look at China domination. China domination, isn't it? Now, in order to understand China domination, well, we really have to understand how the Chinese thinks. So in order to understand how they think, because if we don't understand how they think, you won't understand what they're going to do. On one side, you hear people say, hey, they're going to dominate the world. This is what they're doing. Look at how they send the jet fighters across Taiwan Straits. Look at how they impose all sorts of military pressure on Taiwan. And a lot of people are saying, hey, they are going to get Taiwan. They are going to get the world after that. They're going to go for Japan and then Korea, so on and so forth. Is that true? On the other hand, if you look at China, they said, no, they're not going for any kind of domination. So who is lying or who is telling the truth? Now, in order to understand this, let's try to understand how they reason, how the logic actually goes within the Chinese. Now, in order to understand the logic of the Chinese, one good way is to look at medicine, look at how they diagnose people. Now, try to imagine this. In the Western society, when you diagnose people, you look at all sorts of measurements. Say, for example, blood pressure, you do blood check, you do all sorts of readings, x-rays, CAT scans, MRIs, etc., etc. But the thing is, if you look at ancient China, or you look at how Chinese does traditional Chinese medicine, you realize they don't actually look at these things. Instead, they look at four things in what they call the full consultation. So what are those things? There are affection, auscultation, inspection, and inquiry. Now, you might ask, what are these? Okay, basically, it means they're going to ask the patient, well, you are going to tell me how you feel. They're going to look at inspect the look of the patient, and then they're going to sort of check the pulse, and finally they're going to check the breathing. So are they going to take any measurements? Well, traditionally no. So you might ask, what does that tell you? That means in the Western culture, they look at details, fine details of anything before they make decisions. But for Chinese, they don't do it that way. They look at a person as if it were a black box, which means they look at what's going to go in that black box and what's going to come out from that black box. Meaning what? Say, for example, you might realize in Chinese, in ancient China, they do sort of use herbs in order to treat people. So you might ask, what exactly are they doing when they use herbs? Now, when they use herbs, contrary to what the Western medicine actually do, is that they give you the herb, they give you that potion. Once you have this potion, you got well, so the herb must be working. Now, try to imagine this. They don't know what's happening inside. Mind you, there wasn't any x-ray, there wasn't any operations available back then in ancient China. So for Chinese, instead of looking at the fine details, they look at the large picture. Now, you might say, wait a minute, what has this to do with China domination? Well, you need to understand how they look at the world. Now, another example is with the history. China wasn't one nation until 200 BC. And after that, after 200 BC, China has basically been always just one nation. So unity is something that they really wanted. Because why? Look at what they treasure. The Great War. Now, the Great War was built by Emperor Qin, the first emperor who ruled China back in 200 BC. Now, before that time, China was like warring states. China was like all sorts of fragmented states with different languages, with different writings, with different character sets, with different measurements, with all sorts of different stuff. But then after 200 BC, this unified China came into existence. Over the last 2,300 years, China is basically one single country. The mentality is simple. Unification is above everything. Now, look at what happened in the West, the Roman Empire. In the Western world, instead of becoming one big country from a number of smaller countries, they basically split up to become a lot of, smaller countries like France, Germany, Italy, things like that. And if you've noticed, they don't actually have a problem with unification. Why do we need to be unified? They don't actually have that kind of a mentality. If you try to compare the two examples that I just talked about, the diagnose and the history thing, you realize the West and the East are basically tackling the same problem from a very different perspective. In terms of medicine, the West actually does it from inside out, whereas in the East, they do that from the outside in. So they don't know what's actually happening inside. It's just that they realize if these other things that appear on the outside of it, then something has to be wrong within. This is sort of how they manage to diagnose people, to diagnose patients. Now, in terms of the country thing, one major difference between the East and the West is that in the West, they talk about democracy. Wait a minute, when was the last time you need to talk about democracy? Because you have a bunch of people and you need to find that consensus. So you use democracy. But in China, when they're talking about unification, if you've ever watched my other videos, you realize I've been talking about the West being the individualistic people, whereas the East being the collectivists. And the West is what we call a small power distance society, whereas the East is what we call a large power distance society, meaning these people are going to expect unquestioning loyalty from the younger ones, from the people. Now, if you're trying to, go from that kind of a perspective, then you would see in the West, they're talking about getting a consensus among all sorts of different people. So they're talking about a nation state, whereas in the East, they don't talk about the nation state because they're not actually asking for consensus. They're asking for agreement. They're asking for obedience because what really matters for them would be the unification thing. So it has to be united. So the problem comes. Over the last 200 years, well, basically the whole world is developed or has been developing using the mindset of the Western world. Whereas you don't actually see a lot of examples in the East where they develop the society into a modern society or develop their ancient societies into something modern. So all these examples basically come from the West. So there's no such example coming from the East in a way. Well, of course, there were ancient societies, ancient civilizations that were very successful, but the problem is, over the last 200 years, you don't see a lot. Now, here comes the issue. Whatever method you see today in developing society basically comes from the West. Now, that explains why the West, or the entire world, you might say, might assess the East using Western values. But are these values still correct? Now, the reason why I have to talk about this, it's not because they're not correct. It's just because they're not applicable to the East. Now, let's say, for instance, given the fact that Chinese were actually thinking of things from outside in, whereas Westerners would actually think of, okay, I need to know what exactly is happening inside that body, inside that person, so that I can know how to cure that particular disease, whereas in the East, they're talking about just the black box. I don't need to know what happens inside. I'm just talking about what's general from the outside. Now, if you try to apply that kind of a mentality into looking into what China is doing right now, then probably you would see a totally different picture. Let's say, for instance, when those reports that says China was sending those jet fighters across the Taiwan Straits, well, dozens of jet fighters going through the Taiwan Straits, what really happened was, wait a minute, they are actually trying to look at Taiwan as part of their civilization. Why? Because they're not thinking of Taiwan as another country. So from their perspective, they're not invading anything, but rather they're trying to maintain the unity of a civilization or of a civilization of Chinese. So you would notice that they are not thinking of any further expansion because that's not actually an expansion. Now, but from the West, what they see is, whoa, wait a minute, China is now expanding its power, towards Taiwan. And sooner or later, they're going to expand to Japan, Korea, and so on and so forth. Now, wait a minute. If you understand that that's not actually expansion from China's perspective, then obviously there will be no domination. Now, domination only occurs when you expand, and expand. But if you are already contained within that civilization thing, which is the Chinese civilization, then you're already bounded. And the furthest distance that you can get in terms of this boundary is Taiwan. So from their perspective, they're not thinking of themselves as in any way invading, but rather they are trying to get that slice of pizza that they think they should have, and in order to make that pizza complete. So if you look at it that way, so if you understand this, you see China isn't expanding. Now you might argue, what about the Belt and Road Initiative of China? Well, they're expanding into Africa. They're expanding into all the neighboring nations by using infrastructure projects. Are they not expanding in a way? Now, wait a minute. If you try to apply the same concept of what I'm telling you just back then into Africa, you would see, and by the way, when was the last time you heard of an African colony? Well, Africa, a lot of countries in Africa have been colonized by Western powers. But when was the last time you saw an African colony lying somewhere out there? Never. So if you realize that Africans basically, a lot of them were victims of slavery, then you realize one thing: they don't expand either. When they don't expand, and when they also exhibit a very similar nature of what the Chinese were doing, they sort of understand each other. So when the Chinese actually help these people, when the Chinese help the Africans with all these projects, what happened with the Africans is that they don't see that as an invasion, but instead they see that as help. Now, that's why we need to understand the mentality. We have to understand the angle from which we have to tackle these problems. Because if you keep on thinking of it with the Western philosophy way, you would always see China expanding. You would always see China being a threat. But if you realize that that is not expansion in the minds of the Chinese, then you realize they're not even expanding at all. So, next time when you think of China domination, try to think of it from their perspective. Or else you won't be able to understand why they did it in the first place, or why they're not doing it in the first place. And even with the intention, how would you be able to understand the intention? So, that is something we have to really look into. And by the way, talking about not looking into something, that explains why. Well, from my perspective, I see the West as not really taking China seriously. Why? Because if you really take somebody seriously, you probably want to understand anything from her perspective. So, if you're really going to sort of analyze what China is doing, please take it seriously and try to think of it from their perspective. Because if you don't take China seriously, what happens is you are going to scare the shit out of yourself. China is not invading. So think twice. So until then, ciao.
Before you leave, please be sure to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and share this with your friends. See you in the next episode.